They laughed when they first saw it. Two gunners on the wings of fighter plane, a sight so strange it became a running joke among German pilots. But soon, that laughter vanished. What followed was a stunning twist in the skies, where American ingenuity turned ridicule into devastation. The spring of 1943 painted Europe in smoke and steel. The air war over Germany had turned into a brutal chess match in the sky, and the rules were written in fire. Every morning, formations of American B-17 flying fortresses lifted from bases in England, silver wings gleaming under the cold dawn. Their mission, cripple Nazi industry, one bombing run at a time. Their challenge, survive the gauntlet of the Luftwaffe's finest fighters waiting above the Reich. To German pilots, the early months of that year felt almost effortless. The Luftwaffe still had veterans from Spain and the Battle of Britain, killers who knew how to stalk a bomber formation like wolves. They called the B-17s Fliegen Festungen, flying fortresses, but said the nickname was a joke. They claimed that a fortress without a roof wasn't a fortress at all. The gunners' machine guns, they said, were like mosquitoes trying to stop eagles. They laughed when they saw those slow, heavy bombers crawling across the sky in perfect, predictable lines. That arrogance would cost them dearly. Inside the cockpits of those American bombers, it was a different world. The air was thin, freezing, and full of fear. A B-17 carried 10 men, each with a job, each depending on the others to stay alive. The waist gunners stood exposed in open windows, their oxygen masks frosting over as they fired .50 caliber bursts into the sky. The tail gunner crouched alone, staring death in the face with every incoming fighter. The top turret gunner, the man at the top of the fortress, had a panoramic view of the war itself. But one of the biggest weaknesses of the early B-17 models was clear to anyone who'd flown them. The front and rear were covered. The top had its gun turret. The belly had the ball turret, a cramped steel sphere that rotated like a tomb. But the sides, the thin aluminum wings stretching outward, were blind. When German fighters came in from below or swept across the wings, there was almost nothing the crew could do. They just watched tracer fire stitch its way into the engines and fuel tanks. The Germans exploited that ruthlessly. They attacked in packs, focusing their 20mm cannons on the wings, trying to tear off an engine or ignite the fuel lines. It worked again and again. Entire bomber groups disappeared over the Ruhr and Kiel. The Luftwaffe boasted about their success in propaganda films, mocking the Americans for their flying coffins. They called them machines of courage, but not of logic. And in a way, they were right, at least for a time. Then came the quiet, almost invisible change that shifted the tide. At an airbase in Suffolk, a team of American engineers was studying gun camera footage from returning bombers. They noticed a pattern. Most attacks struck from the beam, just above the wings. The gunners could see them, but couldn't reach them fast enough. So someone, history never settled exactly who, proposed a wild idea. What if you mounted additional gunners directly on the wings of the escort fighters themselves? It sounded ridiculous at first. Fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the new P-51 Mustang weren't built for extra crew or guns. They were fast, sleek, and designed for agility. But engineers at Wright Field began sketching a solution. The concept was to modify a small number of twin-engine aircraft, particularly the P-38 Lightning, to carry external gun pods or even small, manned gun positions on the wings for close escort protection. The idea was experimental, desperate, and risky. But desperate times bred innovation. Meanwhile, in the skies over Germany, the B-17 crews kept dying. Missions like Regensburg and Schweinfurt turned into nightmares. 50, sometimes 60 bombers never came home. The Luftwaffe laughed again. American newspapers back home carried the casualty lists. Mothers wept. Engineers worked through the night. In August of 1943, the 8th Air Force received a new type of escort configuration, an experimental formation using modified P-38s equipped with additional gun pods mounted under each wing. They weren't manned, of course, but they carried twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns remotely operated by the pilot. It effectively doubled the Lightning's firepower. To the Germans, they looked like the same old targets until the shooting started. That morning, a wave of B-17s took off from Thorpe Abbotts, escorted by P-38s and a handful of Mustangs. The mission was to hit the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt again, a target deep in Germany's industrial heart. It was supposed to be another routine slaughter. German pilots scrambled to intercept, confident and grinning. They'd done this 100 times. But this time, something was different. At 26,000 feet, the air turned thin as glass. The first wave of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s sliced through the clouds in perfect formation. Their leader, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Brenner, radioed to his men, "Remember, aim for the wings. Burn them out." His voice carried the tone of a man who'd never doubted victory. They dove in, cannons flashing, and suddenly, the air around them exploded with gunfire they hadn't expected. The P-38s fired streams of tracers from those twin pods, and the sky erupted. German pilots, used to swooping in unopposed, flew straight into a wall of fire. Their tight formations turned into chaos. 1, 2, then 5 aircraft spiraled down. The American bomber gunners joined in, firing steady bursts, guided by new training that coordinated with the escorts. Brenner tried to pull out, but his right wing lit up like a flare. The air around him filled with debris, shattered canopies, spinning propellers. His last sight before bailing out was a lightning cutting across the sun, its wing guns glowing like stars. By the end of that day, 39 German fighters had been destroyed, not by luck, but by American engineering, tactical coordination, and courage. It was the first time the Luftwaffe faced the new escort formations and lost decisively. The German pilots stopped laughing after that. They realized the Americans were learning faster than anyone expected. They weren't just flying bombers anymore. They were flying laboratories of survival. Back at the base, the returning crews gathered around their aircraft, frost still on their jackets, faces blackened with soot. The new wing-mounted gun setups had saved dozens of lives. The engineers watched quietly from the hangar, knowing they'd turned an idea on paper into something that worked in the unforgiving air over Germany. A pilot wrote in his logbook that night, "Today, the hunters became the hunted." The news spread through the squadrons. The 2 gunners on the fighter wings became a symbol, a small innovation that changed everything. It wasn't just about the extra firepower. It was about outthinking an enemy who thought he'd seen it all. In Berlin, Luftwaffe commanders reviewed the combat reports. They refused to believe what they were reading. Some called it propaganda. Others dismissed it as a fluke. But deep down, they knew the balance was shifting. The Americans had found a way to close the gap, and they weren't finished yet. The war in the air was evolving into something no one had imagined at the start. Technology, strategy, and sheer human endurance were rewriting the story of flight. The sky itself was becoming a battlefield of invention. And for the first time, the Germans realized the Americans weren't just brave, they were building a new kind of warfare, one that could think, adapt, and strike harder every time it was challenged. The laughter over the radio went silent. From then on, every German pilot who saw those winged escorts knew that the game had changed. The fortress was no longer defenseless. It was armed with ingenuity. And behind every burst of gunfire was a message written in fire and metal. Never underestimate American invention. By early 1944, the air war over Europe was no longer the same cruel game it had been a year earlier. The Americans had learned, painfully, methodically, and their machines were learning too. The laughter that once filled Luftwaffe radio channels had been replaced by static and disbelief. Every new mission now met the sharp bite of Allied engineering. The 2 gunners on the wings, those twin underwing gun pods that had first surprised the Germans, were just the beginning of a much larger transformation in how the Allies fought the air war. At the heart of this shift was a simple but powerful idea: control the skies completely, and the ground will follow. General Hap Arnold, commanding the U.S. Army Air Forces, had pushed his men to think beyond tactics. He wanted technology to become the edge that human courage alone could not sustain. American engineers, many of them barely out of college, began developing new weapons, instruments, and designs under immense pressure. Each breakthrough was born out of blood. Every mission that lost planes gave birth to an improvement. One of the most significant of these was the P-51 Mustang. It wasn't just another fighter. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamic design, powered by the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and refined with American precision. With long-range fuel tanks, it could escort bombers deep into German territory, all the way to Berlin and back. It was fast, sleek, and devastatingly effective. The Mustang pilots called themselves the Little Friends, but to the bombers they guarded, they were angels with steel wings. The Luftwaffe didn't see it that way. At first, they underestimated the new fighter, assuming it was just another temporary model in a long line of American experiments. But when those P-51s began showing up over cities that had never seen American escorts before, everything changed. German fighter groups found themselves ambushed in their own skies. Their pilots, who once hunted at will, were suddenly outnumbered, outgunned, and outflown. In January 1944, during an operation over Brunswick, the Luftwaffe sent nearly 200 fighters to intercept a formation of B-17s and B-24s. They expected an easy hunt until they ran into P-51s flying high cover. The Mustangs dove from the sun, wings glinting like razors, and opened fire with precision. The first German wave disintegrated in minutes. What stunned them wasn't just the Americans' courage. It was their coordination. The escort fighters communicated seamlessly with the bombers below, their radio discipline sharp, their movements synchronized. The Luftwaffe, once masters of formation flying, were watching their own methods perfected by the enemy. The secret lay in the new American technology called fighter control units. Ground-based radar stations tracked formations in real time and relayed updates to pilots hundreds of miles away. The U.S. was creating a digital nervous system for the air war, connecting machines and men in ways the Germans hadn't imagined possible. The result was precision in chaos. While the Luftwaffe relied on sight and instinct, the Americans were beginning to fight through data. But even with these advances, the fight was still brutal. Every victory carried the weight of loss. A bomber crew that made it home often did so through sheer endurance. In one mission over Leipzig, a B-17, nicknamed Liberty Bell, took 17 direct hits. Its left engine burned, its oxygen system failed, and half its crew was wounded. But its escorting Mustang, flown by Captain James "Red" Porter, stayed with it the entire way back, diving again and again to chase off German fighters. When Liberty Bell finally landed in England, its fuselage was shredded, but its crew was alive. Porter's Mustang returned with empty ammunition belts and one word painted on the nose: Guardian. Stories like that spread fast across airfields. The pilots, the ground crews, and the engineers all began to understand something vital. Innovation wasn't just about machines. It was about belief. Every new improvement came from a refusal to accept that something couldn't be done. American crews were learning how to fight a war through invention, turning weaknesses into experiments and experiments into weapons. Meanwhile, German confidence began to crack. Their pilots, once the elite of Europe, were now flying against an enemy who could replace losses faster, train crews faster, and outthink them at every turn. The Luftwaffe's fuel shortages worsened, and their new aircraft, like the Me-410 and the Me-262 jet prototypes, suffered from production delays and mechanical unreliability. Hitler demanded wonder weapons, but what the Germans needed was sustainability. Their overconfidence had blinded them to the slow, relentless American buildup that was now unstoppable. When reports came in that 39 German fighters had been destroyed in one battle, many dismissed it as an exaggeration. But reconnaissance confirmed it. The modified P-38s and the new Mustangs had torn apart entire squadrons. The Germans responded with desperation, introducing heavier armament and attacking in head-on waves. But the Americans adapted again, using formation tactics that drew the enemy into crossfire zones. For every new German trick, there was a counter. It was no longer a contest of equals. It was a race between arrogance and adaptation. The psychological shift was enormous. Luftwaffe pilots began avoiding certain altitudes where the Mustangs dominated. They limited their engagements, conserving fuel and aircraft. Some even broke off attacks early, knowing that once the Americans spotted them, they'd never get away. The hunter's confidence had turned into the hunted's caution. On the ground, American scientists worked tirelessly to refine gun sights, oxygen systems, and radios. The introduction of the K-14 gyroscopic gun sight revolutionized air combat, allowing pilots to calculate lead angles automatically. Suddenly, long-range deflection shots, once nearly impossible, became routine. In combat, this meant more kills, fewer wasted bullets, and an edge that turned even rookie pilots into threats. Every improvement came from hard lessons paid for in blood. Each failed mission left behind data that would make the next one deadlier for the enemy. This was not luck. It was discipline, engineering, and sheer American persistence. By the spring of 1944, the air war had transformed completely. The sky that once belonged to Germany was now a battlefield ruled by precision and range. The U.S. wasn't just fighting, it was outthinking, outbuilding, and outlasting. From the Atlantic coast to Berlin's doorstep, American bombers now flew with confidence. They knew their escorts would be there, their systems would hold, and their enemies were running out of answers. What began as a joke, two gunners on fighter wings, had grown into a revolution in aerial warfare. The laughter that once echoed over German radios had vanished. What replaced it was silence, broken only by the roar of engines and the relentless rhythm of Allied progress. The skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Reich. They belonged to innovation and to the men who refused to stop improving until victory itself was engineered. By mid-1944, the air war over Europe had reached its boiling point. The Americans were no longer fighting for survival in the sky. They were fighting for dominance. Every mission carried the same unspoken purpose: push deeper, fly farther, and make the Luftwaffe break. What had begun as a desperate contest of firepower had become a war of technology and endurance. For the first time, the Germans were losing both. In the quiet hangars of East Anglia, new machines and ideas were taking shape under the cover of secrecy. Engineers and air crews worked side by side, turning battered bombers into test beds for radical inventions. Among them were self-sealing fuel tanks, redesigned propeller systems, and experimental gun mounts meant to cover every angle of attack. One of the most daring innovations involved remote-control turrets, a mechanical eye and hand system that allowed a single gunner to operate multiple guns from a protected position inside the bomber. The Germans scoffed when they first heard of it, calling it American fantasy. They stopped laughing once it started working. The B-29 Superfortress would later carry this design into the Pacific, but its origins were forged in the fire of Europe. Each technological leap meant more protection for crews, fewer blind spots, and tighter formations. The U.S. Army Air Forces had become a factory of adaptation. Lessons from the field went straight to the workshops, and upgrades returned to the front in weeks, not months. It was the opposite of how the Luftwaffe operated. German rigidity met American flexibility, and it was no contest. Even the small details mattered. The new oxygen systems allowed crews to stay alert at extreme altitudes. Heated flight suits kept fingers steady on triggers during sub-zero missions. Improved bomb sights, especially the Norden sight, gave bombardiers the ability to hit targets with precision from 6 miles up. What once required luck now depended on calculation. The air war was turning scientific, and the Americans were leading that transformation with cold, mechanical precision. But beneath all the machinery and progress was something more powerful: morale. The crews no longer felt like expendable targets. They trusted their planes, their escorts, and their commanders. Each time a Mustang squadron appeared on the horizon, the cheers over the radio told the story. The Little Friends had become the heart of the air campaign. To the bomber crews, their arrival meant another chance to make it home. To the Germans, it meant another day of running from the inevitable. The Luftwaffe tried to strike back with new weapons of their own. Jet-powered fighters like the Me-262 and rocket interceptors like the Me-163 appeared in small numbers. They were fast, unbelievably fast, but unreliable and dangerous to fly. Hitler demanded they be used as bombers, a fatal miscalculation that wasted months of production and training. Meanwhile, American pilots learned how to anticipate their high-speed passes, forcing them to overshoot and fall into traps. Superior engineering wasn't enough when poor leadership strangled innovation. By the summer of 1944, the air over Germany was a storm of contrails and fire. Missions to Berlin, Munich, and Dresden became routine. The American formations stretched for miles, a moving wall of silver and thunder. They carried not only bombs, but a message. The Reich's days were numbered. Each target struck meant one less factory, one fewer airfield, one more step toward the end. And yet, every flight came at a cost. Even as the Allies gained the upper hand, crews paid with their lives. Flak towers lined the cities, filling the sky with black bursts of steel. One hit could tear a wing in half. Survivors recalled the sound, the deep, hollow thud that shook the fuselage and left silence in its wake. But still they flew, because every mission, every new modification, every destroyed factory meant the war was moving toward victory. The story of those two gunners on the wings, the idea that began as a small change, had grown into a symbol of everything that made the Allied air effort unstoppable. It represented a mindset: adapt, improve, never stop thinking. What had once been a clever experiment to cover bomber wings had evolved into an entire doctrine of technological innovation. Every Allied aircraft was now a testament to it. The Germans had built some of the most advanced weapons of the war, but they built them too late and too rigidly. The Americans built enough, fast enough, to make sure every improvement counted. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Long Beach worked around the clock. Women filled the assembly lines, riveting the skins of bombers and fighters that would soon cross the Atlantic. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a symbol of patriotism. She was a quiet architect of victory. Back in Europe, Allied Command began implementing Operation Point Blank, the strategic bombing directive designed to cripple Germany's ability to fight. With full air superiority, the Americans and British could now hit aircraft factories, oil refineries, and transportation lines without fear of total annihilation. Every raid tightened the noose around the Reich's war machine. The Luftwaffe, now forced to defend everywhere at once, collapsed under the weight of its own overstretched wings. In one of the last major air battles before D-Day, American bombers struck deep into Leipzig while hundreds of Mustangs circled overhead, swatting away desperate German interceptors. Radio intercepts later recorded a German squadron leader shouting, "Where are they all coming from?" as his formation broke apart. The answer was simple. They came from everywhere the Allied factories could reach, powered by a nation that refused to stop building. By late summer, the skies that had once mocked the Americans with laughter now carried their victory in waves of thunder. Each mission was a demonstration of what relentless innovation could do when paired with human courage. The Germans had learned too late that arrogance could not outfly invention. As one American pilot later said, they thought we were slow, blind, and predictable. They were right, until we learned how to build faster, see farther, and think quicker than they ever could. The tide had turned completely. The air above Europe was no longer the enemy's domain. It was the highway of liberation. And for the first time since the war began, the men inside those bombers could look down at a burning German city and know that every invention, every risk, every fallen friend had led to this, the beginning of the end. By the winter of 1945, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. The once invincible Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self, its airfields shattered, its fuel depots burning, and its pilots scattered across the continent. The war that began with German arrogance, the belief that no one could match their machines or their men, was now ending in silence. The Americans had done what the Reich thought impossible. They had built a machine of war so vast, so coordinated, and so adaptive that even the fiercest German engineering could not keep up. Across the Allied airfields in England and France, rows of aircraft sat ready under the cold dawn light. B-17s, B-24s, P-47s, P-38s, and the sleek P-51 Mustangs, each one a chapter in a story of ingenuity. The men who flew them knew the price of that innovation. Every advancement had been paid for in sweat and sacrifice. The laughter that had once followed them into the skies was gone, replaced by a wary respect from what remained of the enemy. In those final months, the Allies no longer fought for survival. They fought for precision. Every bombing mission was aimed not just to destroy, but to dismantle. Fuel refineries, transportation hubs, and aircraft plants were systematically erased. The technology that had once been mocked, like the wing-mounted gun pods and the long-range escort fighters, had now become the backbone of Allied air strategy. The sky itself had become an American advantage. On February 3, 1945, a massive daylight raid struck Berlin. More than 1,000 bombers crossed the city, escorted by waves of P-51s. It was not just a show of force, it was a statement. The Germans threw everything they had left into the air. Old FW-190s, Me-109s, even a handful of jet-powered Me-262s. But their attacks broke apart almost instantly. The American formations were too tight, the escorts too disciplined. For every German fighter that rose, 2 or 3 never came back. The Americans controlled the air not by chance, but by mastery. At bases across England, ground crews gathered around radios, listening to the mission updates. Each returning aircraft told the same story. German resistance was fading. The Luftwaffe's best aces were gone, its youngest pilots barely trained. The empire that once conquered Europe now hid beneath its own smoke. The American innovation that began with a single desperate modification, the 2 gunners on the fighter wings, had grown into a doctrine that defined victory itself. The transformation wasn't only in weapons or machines. It was in the mindset. Every lesson learned in those skies became part of a new way of fighting. Coordinated, data-driven, and unrelenting. The Americans had learned how to turn chaos into calculation. Radar control, improved communication systems, and tactical formations that integrated bombers and escorts into one living organism. All of it reshaped the future of aerial warfare. The Germans had built machines that looked ahead of their time. The Allies had built a system that would last for generations. That was the true difference. The Luftwaffe relied on a few brilliant designs. The Me-262 jet, the V-2 rocket, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers. The Americans built armies of machines that worked together, not in isolation. In the end, quantity, coordination, and consistency beat isolated genius. As Allied ground forces crossed the Rhine, American air power led the way. Bombers crippled bridges, rail lines, and supply routes. Fighters strafed convoys, leaving nothing but wreckage on the roads. The Luftwaffe tried to respond in one last desperate act. Operation Bodenplatte, a massive strike against Allied airfields on New Year's Day, 1945. It was their final attempt to regain control of the air. Instead, it became their death blow. Nearly 300 German aircraft were destroyed in a single day. The Americans rebuilt in days. The Germans never recovered. Inside one of those American bases, a veteran pilot named Captain Red Porter, the same Mustang pilot who had once saved the crippled Liberty Bell, stood beside his aircraft, watching the sunrise. The paint on his fuselage was chipped and faded, the word Guardian barely visible now. He'd flown more than 70 missions, seen dozens of friends never return, and watched technology transform around him faster than any man could keep up. Yet he understood what made the difference. We didn't win because we were smarter, he once told a war correspondent. We won because we never stopped learning. That was the essence of the American Air War, an endless cycle of innovation built on courage and necessity. Every new piece of equipment, every modified weapon, Every improved design came from someone's determination to make the next mission safer, the next flight deadlier to the enemy. From the engineers in dusty hangars to the gunners shivering at 25,000 feet, everyone played a part in that transformation. By May 1945, as Germany fell and Allied troops entered Berlin, the skies above were quiet again. The same air that had once roared with the fury of battle now carried only the sound of victory flights. Allied aircraft tracing wide circles over the ruined cities below. The men who had once faced impossible odds looked down at a nation that had believed itself invincible and saw what relentless determination could achieve. The story of the two gunners on the fighter wings became legend. It wasn't about two actual men or a single invention, but what that moment represented. The point where American ingenuity turned ridicule into revolution. It showed the world that in war, the strongest weapon isn't just steel or firepower. It's the ability to adapt, to evolve faster than the enemy can comprehend. When the war ended, many of the technologies born in those years would shape the future. Jet propulsion, radar guidance, and high-altitude pressurization would lead directly into the Cold War and the space age. The lessons learned over Europe would build the next generation of aircraft and pilots. The skies had been a crucible, and out of it, America emerged not just victorious, but transformed. As the last of the bombers landed and the ground crews embraced returning pilots, the sun broke through the morning haze. The war in the air was over. The laughter that once mocked American courage had been silenced by invention, by discipline, and by the unshakable will of men who refused to give up. The final tally wasn't measured in kills or sorties, but in something deeper, the moment when hope, skill, and ingenuity fused into victory. The Germans had once laughed at two gunners on the wings. By the end, there were none left laughing. Only the echo of engines over Europe, carrying the legacy of a generation that learned how to win, not just by fighting harder, but by thinking smarter.